right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa / Perspectiva. Today's session is called Don't Look Up. The Metacrisis is not in the sky. And this is a co-hosted event between the Stoa and Perspectiva. So I imagine some of us here are familiar with both the Stoa and Perspectiva, but if not, I'll give a brief explanation of both. Perspectiva is a community of expert generalists on an urgent 100-year project to improve the relationships between systems, souls, and society in theory and practice. And they're doing a lot of good para-academic work. So I definitely recommend checking out their website here. I'll put it in the chat in a moment. And the Stoa is something I take great care not to define, so it can remain a mystery even to myself. If that's not too pretentious or weird for you, you can check out the Stoa at thestoa.ca. And today we have the co-founder and director of Perspectiva, Jonathan Rowson. Jonathan is a philosopher, author, and chess grandmaster. His work ranges from climate change to spirituality, and of course, the Metacrisis, which we'll get to today in a moment. So Jonathan has one of the best takes on the Metacrisis, in my opinion, so I'm quite excited about this session. And we're going to talk about the film Don't Look Up and how it's related to the Metacrisis. So how today's going to work, the first part, Jonathan's going to share his thoughts on the film, like why he thinks it's important, how it excited him, and we'll take some shares and questions. And then the second part will be about the Metacrisis, and then we'll take some more shares and questions. So if you have any questions or shares during the Q&A portion, put in the chat, I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself and ask your question, or just raise your hand, and then I'll call on you to ask your question to Jonathan. So that being said, Jonathan, welcome to the Stoa / Perspectiva, and Tag, you're it, my friend.
Thank you so much, Peter. I hope you can all hear me okay, and thanks for joining. Good. So what we're going to do is the first session is going to be kind of stream of consciousness, why this is such an important, lovely movie, and the second part's a little bit more analytical about the Metacrisis, and in between we'll get a chance to hear back from everyone about their own thoughts, and partly on what I've said and partly maybe their own perspectives on the film. Where to start? So the first thing to say is this movie, even the word movie is interesting, because I was listening to a conversation with Jim Rutt recently where he used the word movie, and he said apparently nobody under 30 uses the word movie anymore. So if it's a sort of sign that you're older if you're saying movie. But anyway, this film, what is it? You know, like, is it a comedy? Is it a satire? Is it a dark comedy? There's a case to be made that it's actually a documentary, and we'll come to that in just one second. But for those, I'm assuming everyone here has seen the film. I know that one or two of you may have sneakily not seen it and come along anyway. But just a very quick recap for those who maybe saw it a few weeks back and are still getting their bearings. In essence, it's a film directed by Adam McKay, and it's about a comet hurtling towards the Earth with an alarmingly specific time frame of 6 months and 14 days. And two relatively undistinguished scientists discover this fact. They try and convey it initially to the political powers that be, and then to the press. And in both occasions, with very mixed success, they don't really get anywhere. When action does begin to happen, it's not because of any deep concern for the problem itself, but rather because it serves other political ends to attend to it. And throughout it, what we're looking at really are the anguish and struggle of regular human beings desperate to convey something truthful. So this is a film really about what it's like to live in a reality avoidant culture. It's primarily about the experience of living with reality avoidance and what it does to us. In that sense, there's a couple of things to say about it. First of all, there is an authorial intent here. I mean, Adam McKay has his own view of what it's for. He's working with Leonardo DiCaprio, who's one of the main actors. And they're both well known for being politically very progressive. They've done work on related matters before. But it's important to understand that just because they have a particular idea for what the movie is about, it doesn't follow that we have to see it only in that way. Back in 1969, any sort of literature scholars here will know Roland Barthes famously wrote an essay called "The Author is Dead." And while there's been much scholarship since then, in essence, the idea is just because somebody intends for something to mean something, it doesn't mean we have to take that meaning as the exclusive one, right? So most see this as a film about climate change. And that's the tack I'm going to take primarily. But it's worth knowing in passing that there are some who can see it more existentially. You can see the comet hurtling towards Earth as the human days ticking down, the fact that we're all going to die inevitably, eventually. And there's a question of what we do with our time to make meaning in the days we have left. Whether that's 30,000 days or 3 days or whatever. The second thing to say about this is that it can be seen as something about the pandemic, because again, it's something to do with responding to scientists, and science is saying, we really understand what's going on here and you don't, and I'm telling you based on my knowledge, this is what has to happen. I don't think that was their intent, but equally, it's possible to view it that way, and some have. The important thing to grasp, though, is that when we're speaking of this as a climate issue, this is not an analogy. This is not a good analogy for climate change, right? But it's a great metaphor. So what do I mean by that? A comet hurtling towards Earth is not something that we can deal with adaptively. It's not a cultural matter. It's not a matter of behavior. It's not a matter of social change, the economy. It's just a technical problem. It's a problem of, can you stop the force of this object from causing unbelievable destruction on the Earth? And in the film, it's sort of an Everest-sized object. I think they say 9 kilometers, and it's going to hit off the coast of Chile. But through that impact, it's not just going to harm that part of the world. It's so powerful that it's what they call a planet killer. Now, is climate change like that? Well, not really. But there is an objective fact of the matter about the nature of the climate conundrum that the metaphor allows us to see. Namely, this is coming. This is here, actually here in the sky coming towards us is not a bad parallel for in the world getting worse. So to see something analogically is to see it, is it like that? Is one thing like the other thing? And we can say, not really. We can say that the comet coming towards us is in most ways more like a technical problem, less like an adaptive challenge, which is what climate change is. But we can say it's a great metaphor, because by looking at the comet coming towards us, suddenly you have this predicament of living in a reality avoidant culture, which is exactly what we have in the context of climate too. Now, as we'll see in a few moments, the climate conundrum sits within lots of other problems. And that's why it's so tricky. And that's what this movie begins to get us towards, that we can't just deal with it as a discrete environmental issue for the green movement. It's altogether more endemic, existential, systemic, paradigmatic, and so forth. It's very much in and of every part of the world. And so the next sort of distinction to make is, whereas the comet is really an object, a big object, it's not a hyper object. So for those unfamiliar, hyper object is a term created by Timothy Morton, who's a kind of ecological philosopher. And it defines phenomena that have enormous distance over time and space. So climate change began a long time in the past, will continue a long time in the future. It exists in every part of the globe, such that, you know, even if you want to choose an image for climate change, you can't really do it. You can choose an aspect of it. You can get a melting glacier or a drowning polar bear or whatever you choose. And there are many great people working on climate visuals, by the way, but you can't get the whole thing. The whole thing is not even the planet Earth. It's everything that's happening within it, within ourselves, between us. It's a problem that pervades life. And that's typical of a hyper object. You cannot, it's sort of everywhere and nowhere at once. And so again, bad analogy, good metaphor, because it's really helpful to think about this as if this were happening, how would we respond? Because we're already there in some ways, but the ways that we're not there are the most revealing, because we don't have a solution to climate change that is like taking down a comet, although arguably geoengineering is a little bit like that. And that's why this film is so good, because where it really comes alive for me is the reality of the power of the tech industry. Because it's in the one early part of the movie, you may know, they meet the president, who is Trumpian in character, but not entirely Trumpian. She's got a little bit of Hillary Clinton about her as well, played by Meryl Streep. And some have even said that she's got a bit of Joe Biden in her, although I've struggled to see that myself. And then her son, who's the chief of staff. So again, a bit of nepotism and corruption is right at the heart of the administration. He's off the charts awful, just completely vain, entirely interested in superficial matters. But he's very well played, and it's a very amusing character to follow. And right at the end of the movie, if you get that far into the credits, and not many people do this, by the way, but if you follow the end of the movie, there's a first mid-credit bit, which is very funny. And then the last mid-credit bit, the last at the end of the credits, is this guy, the chief of staff, who's been abandoned by his mother, is the only person to survive the comet hitting the Earth, suddenly takes a selfie and tries to get it on social media and tells everyone to start following him, even though, of course, he's the only person on Earth, apparently. Now, why does that matter? Because it gets to the absurdity of the distraction that permeates the film. We are all profoundly distracted at a time when we need to be focused. And just as a major collective action problem calls upon us to galvanize our collective strength and really focus on the signal and not the noise, we're inundated with noise and distraction. So the movie is very much about this tension between what we have to do and what we are doing. So a few more human aspects of this. I love the fact that the movie began in a way that you could experience the human being. It begins with somebody spreading their toast. There's a toast pops out, they spread it. Then you quite quickly notice they're cold. They're in some kind of scientific warehouse. It looks like it's far from anywhere. So much volume that it's probably hard to heat it. And they're just like, they're struggling to sort of cope physically. And the whole film, I think, is underestimated in how well it does that. The fact that it manages to convey what it is like to be a human being in these times, when you're on your smartphone, when the news cycle is as it is, when the political dynamics as they are, and yet we go about as the animals, domestic animals that we are, eating our meals, seeing things in passing. I felt the movie did that really well. It captures that sense of, we may have these extraordinary, earth-wide problems, major collective action challenges, but the people called upon to deal with it are these fallible creatures of habit who are, eating packets of crisps and looking for bottles of water. So that kind of gets to the predicament as a whole. And as you know, the film moves towards a very sort of existential space towards the end. It's there's a moment when you think they're maybe going to survive, and they mobilize the forces, and it looks like despite it all, the narrative convention is that they will nonetheless solve the problem. But they don't, and the reason they don't is because a tech billionaire, who, by the way, is beautifully rendered as some kind of combination of different tech billionaires, and some say it's Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos. Others say it's, you add a few in there, you add Tim Cook and a few others as well. But you get this character who could be anywhere between about 40 and about 80, who's sort of baby-like and sort of a bit disconnected and somehow fundamentally stupid and not really reading what's going on, and yet also a kind of genius and knows exactly what's going on. So a very dissonant, eerie figure, but one that we recognize in the tech billionaires of the moment. And the problem is they have the power, and this is what the film conveys well and why it matters today. It conveys that where the power lies today is not so much with the national governments, but with these enormously powerful tech companies, not just because they commandeer our eyes and hands in our smartphones, but because they have so many resources for technological developments that the governments can often only do things with their technology. And that's kind of what happened in the film, except the twist is it didn't really work. And they do indeed die. It does indeed end. And that's typical of films of the moment, actually, and the series of the moment as well. We're getting more and more ready for unpalatable truths. Now, the idea that the good guys always win in the end doesn't seem to be where we are in 2022. We're now in a state of culture where we're quite ready to receive these stories about it all going horribly wrong. There are some saving graces, though, because at the end, there's a sense in which the key characters really do wake up to what matters. And there's a sense in which, had they done that earlier, that would somehow have avoided this, the way the things playing out quite as they did. So those are some of the reasons I love the film. I think it says something about the power of metaphor. It says something about the fact that the climate crisis arises in this contested, technologically mediated, politically corrupted, socially confusing space. And the highlight of the film, if I had to choose one for me, there are many funny moments, as you know, but the highlight in terms of the sort of messaging of it is where, when it becomes clear that the missions have failed, they're having one last concert where Ariana Grande is playing her character more or less as herself on a large stage. And it's like one last hurrah before the comet hits the Earth. And DiCaprio nonetheless cannot, prevent himself from saying something like, find a way to do it yourself, get your own nuclear device, find your own drones and get the nukes, and we can still stop this thing. And there's something tragicomic about that moment in particular, because it gets to the fact that each of us individually have limited amounts of agency. Like, we have a certain amount, it's not nothing, and collectively we can create a lot of power. But there is a gap in the climate crisis between our own perceived sense of what we can do and the enormous sense of what has to be done. And the film captures that particularly well. And then the last thing to say before we take some questions, and we can come back to the metacrisis side of this, is there's a little moment which is almost not noticed because the punchline comes after the credits. But if you may remember, the tech billionaire conveys to Professor Mindy, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, how he will die. That he knows that he's going to die alone. The algorithms are so powerful that he will die alone. And that's actually proven to be false, because DiCaprio rediscovers his family, reconnects with what matters. They have one last meal. They also pray at the meal, which I thought was a very interesting moment. They sort of go back to Christian roots in a certain sense. But also, there was a prediction that did come true. And that was where the president asks, how will I die? And he says, you're going to be eaten by a Brontorac. I've forgotten the word now. I think it's a Brontorac. And he says, we've no idea what it means. And the reason this is actually something to pay attention to, and not just to treat as a simplistic joke, is that if you know anyone working in artificial intelligence, as I do, there's a growing concern about what they call intellectual debt or epistemic debt. And that's the idea that there's a lot of theoryless knowledge now, a lot of knowledge that is sort of popping up as here's the answer, without the mechanisms giving rise to it, making sense of what's really going on. And so when they know that she'll be killed by a Brontorac, they have no idea what it means. And it turns out they land on this planet, and it looks like indeed that is what they had somehow foreseen algorithmically. It's a joke, but it's a dark joke about the fact that a lot of these apparently brilliant tech companies are creating technologies that they themselves cannot control. And the extent of that is a little bit beyond our ken, but it's clearly happening, and people working within the tech companies are saying as much. It's not the old AI monster. It's not like the big monster Terminator coming down the hill. It's more that we're forgetting what it is to be human, and that we're forgetting that it's important that we have some sense of the basis of the knowledge that we're creating. Because if it comes untethered from theory and understanding, it becomes extremely dangerous, which is what's happening now. Most of all, before we get to the metacrisis in a moment, I want to convey that this comet hurtling towards the Earth is quite a true reflection, metaphorically, figuratively, of the climate crisis. And by that, I mean, it's not the case that where we are in climate today is we have to get our act together or it's going to be really bad. That's not it. It's already really bad. We are in some fundamental sense already too late. Now, that's not a counsel of despair. That's not to say that there aren't things we can do and so forth. There's always scope to make things better. And there's lots of good reasons to keep on working for that. But it's important to grasp that this idea that there's something coming our way that will really destroy life as we know it is not fiction. In fact, it's actually is very much the case that the default scenario now is pretty serious climactic disruption which is anything from a hothouse Earth to the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet to the sort of closing off of the Gulf Stream, to all of these things in themselves have problematic effects. They hit biodiversity. The oceans, arguably, because they're getting warmer, also becoming more acidic, and that's creating different kinds of problems. But these environmental issues are not really they're bad enough, but what really matters is the social consequences of those things. Because you reach breadbasket problems where you can't grow crops anymore. And you run into problems of not having access to natural water more likely. And you also have properties being inundated by rising sea levels and so forth. Now, all of that sounds like the character Kate Dibiasky, who found the comet initially, like a kind of alarmism. But the point is that it's not really, it's really a matter of time. The point is not that we're there now, but there are apparently inexorable forces leading that way, and as a default, just as the comet is coming towards Earth as a default. And just as we could, in theory, the movie suggests, intercept the comet, we can intercept the worst case scenarios on climate, but only if we could contend with the metacrisis, which we'll come to shortly. Okay, that's enough for now, and I'm keen to hear what you all made of the film as well.
All right, so if anyone has any kind of shares or questions during this portion, just either put it in the chat or just raise your hand, and I'll call on you. And then Jonathan, just let me know when you'd like to pivot to the metacrisis. But sure. Johannes, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
I like the movie as well as a comedy and as a criticism, as a critique, but isn't it rather postmodern with its metaphor of the comet, just like John Vervaeke's myth of the zombie for today's society, being accurate in depicting our problem, the pickle, but not providing any sort of constructive solution. What can we learn from the movie?
Right. So there's two things. There's things you can learn, and then there's in what sense, I think implicit in your question, not only what can we learn, but in what sense does the movie indicate how we should act? I think that's implicit in what you're asking. Well, two things there. One is, how much can you expect from one piece of art, right? So even if it was the case that all this movie did was a beautiful, new, refreshing rendition of the problem, and I'll try and argue why I think that's the case in a minute, that in itself would be a high-end achievement. And I don't think calling it postmodern is quite right, because I actually see this as quite a metamodern film in the sense that it doesn't just leave you with satire and nihilism. There is a very strong sense of these characters at the end getting back in touch with what matters. There is a very strong sense that reality matters, that truth matters. This is a value-driven film that, yes, is interspersed with a lot of critique and satire and parody and yeah, it's not modernist in any sort of sense of we're making continual progress or whatever, but I do think it's metamodern insofar as where you end up is with some kind of sincere irony, perhaps, or some kind of relationship between truth and falsity that is generative. It's not just, you don't end the film thinking that was meaningless. On the contrary, there's something about the people coming together at the end to pray, especially, but also the choice of the main character not to go on the spacecraft that's going to save him, but rather to die with his friends and family, that brings it back to meaning and purpose. Now, in terms of what we can learn, I'm reminded here vis-a-vis that scene of something that Zach Stein said in an interview he had with Greg Honreeks and John Vervaeke. I think it's the fourth of their conversations, if any of you are in the know about the conversations they've been having about metapsychology. But Zach says the attitude towards climate change should not be, let's do what we can to fix it. The attitude should rather be, let's come together and accept that we've failed. Because only then, through those relationships being of depth and quality, do we actually have a chance of fixing it. So I think that's how I'd answer the question of what it means. It's something about the atmosphere towards the end being one of returning to a kind of deeper, less postmodern, more even pre-modern, but certainly human, and even somewhat transhuman or terrestrial about the message. It doesn't say nothing matters. On the contrary, something precious was lost. And the line of the film, the signature line, as you know, is by DiCaprio, who wrote it, who said it himself ad lib. We really had it all, didn't we? Or it was worse to that effect. So I think it was meaningful, personally. And I think the message of the film is stay with that meaning and fight for it, basically.
Awesome. Thanks, Johannes. Marianne, if you can ask your question.
Hi there, I'm Marianne from Boston.
Hi.
Thank you, Jonathan. I loved your phrase, reality avoidant culture. And what it brings to mind for me is how we live our everyday as human beings, which is avoiding our own death. And it's understandable that, of course, if we think the planet is dying, we're very practiced at that. We know how to do that.
Yeah.
That's how we get up every morning, and that's how we get through every day until we're faced with a crisis that forces us into a look at our own mortality. And you brought up this idea of prayer at the end of the meeting, at the end of the film, not movie, film, bringing the idea of bringing the sacred back into these conversations. I'm not sure how we will survive without it. Yeah. And I'm not being, crazy town about that, but just real, that it feels that without that, I don't know how we grasp what we need to do.
Well, thanks, Marianne. I agree with all of that, to be honest. The issue of the relationship between denying death and denying potential death of planet. Now, when I say death of planet, I can hear the critics in my voice saying, come on, climate change is not that bad. You're not talking about the death of the planet as such. And there's a point there, but we can speak more about that. Degradation, destruction, and dying, or there's layers of these things, but the idea is that unless we do something, it is moving in that direction. What I've always found fascinating about death avoidance is that there's well-known literature about post-traumatic growth, which is basically those who've had a near-death experience, whether in an accident or through a serious illness, and they suddenly find they're well again, but they really did taste death and came very close to it. They turn their lives around. There's a turn towards the intrinsic, there's a turn towards relationships, away from extrinsic goals. What's bizarre about that is that we already know we're going to die, right? But it's as if until we have the kind of visceral reminder, no, not just in general, people will die. You personally, you may actually die. Until we have that taste, we don't seem to be able to transform quite as easily. So I think, but yeah, I think the climate crisis does bring up questions of what on earth are we doing on this tiny, precious, extraordinary, possibly singular planet. So I think it is a religious matter at some level, but how that plays out is a bigger question.
So, do you want to pivot to the metacrisis now, Jonathan?
Yeah, I can see a few hands, but I think there will hopefully be time at the end. Now, just to forewarn you, what I'm about to share is, it's quite brisk. Now, the metacrisis is a huge, capacious, deep phenomenon, and if you want to take longer on it, I suggest a paper that was mentioned in the advert for the event, which I wrote, called Tasting the Pickle, 10 Flavors of Metacrisis and the Appetite for a New Civilization. What I'm about to show you is, for those who've already become aware of the metacrisis in outline, it will give them another way of thinking about it. And for those who've never heard of it, it will give them a way to start thinking about it. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm just saying that as a kind of preemptive apology that I have to go through this quite fast, throw quite a lot at you, but hope you can begin to see its relevance to the film. So I'm just going to find that now on here. Am I sharing my screen, Peter, yet?
You should have access, and you're not sharing it yet.
1 second, hang on, I'll just do that, excuse me. Share screen. Right, and we're going here, I think. Share. Yeah, here we go. Okay, and I'll play this. Right, so those of you who know John Vervaeke will know he has a model, a sort of cognitive science model of 4 ways of knowing, which are to know something propositionally, basically to know what it is, to know something procedurally to know how to do it, to know something in a perspectival way, to know it from somewhere, and to know something, almost the experience of it, to know what it's like to be inside it, to do it, a sort of participatory way of knowing. Those 4 ways of knowing, I think, are quite a good way both to kind of update your knowledge about the metacrisis, but also to see where the Don't Look Up film fits in. I'm going to go through them reasonably fast to get back to the film. So first of all, what is the metacrisis? Now, there are lots of answers to this question, not just one, not just the one on this screen, but perhaps the most crystalline, and those who know Daniel know he is rather crystalline, very clear articulation of what it is propositionally. It's a global problem which arises from an underlying set of generator functions. So that when we look at all of our different problems that are not just climate change, but also biodiversity loss, the problems of making sense of the world, democratic breakdown, cultural polarization, the sort of fragility of the economy and so forth. When you look at all those things, they're all sort of driven by 3 main underlying patterns. And he calls them riverless dynamics, which runs into the problem of basically when one side does something, they get a significant advantage unless the other side does it too. So it's a sort of game theoretic understanding of the world getting worse because we're competing, but we're competing in a way that's actually harmful because each side tries to get a competitive advantage by playing somewhat unfairly, and the other side really to keep up has to do the same or worse. There's also the issue of subsuming the ecological substrate. That's basically saying that rather than allowing a regenerative ecology whereby you use something and at least as much grows back or more, we're actually destroying the very sort of ecological capital, if you like, on which the health of the planet is based. We're eating into the principle, as they call it in financial terms. So we're harming ourselves at the fundamental level of the ecology such that we can't regenerate. And then, oh, sorry, I've got a typo there, but exponential technology is the third. That image comes from Oliver Rowson, who's no relation of mine as far as I know, but he's got a bit of my name in his second name. It's a bigger image and a very nice one you can find online. Now, this is a really good what is it way of answering the metacrisis, right? But it doesn't give you everything. It doesn't tell you what it feels like. It doesn't tell you what to do about it. It doesn't really convey a sort of inherent know-how with it. So I would say the metacrisis as proposition is very important, and that's a decent distillation of it. Problem: too much competition in the world of the wrong kind, crazily consuming our ecological basis, and technology that is creating new technology all the time in a dangerous kind of escalating way, such that private actors can have access to potentially very destructive technology. So one example of that is to being able to hire a drone, pay for a drone, make your own biological weapon. Crazy person puts biological weapon in drone, flies it into a city, kaboom. Like, simplistic, but it's that kind of problem at a global scale. And that's not before you mention artificial intelligence or synthetic biology or the way that the metaverse is going to play out with virtual reality and so forth. So that's what it is, the metacrisis. That's one way of looking at it. But how do you get it in perspective? This is where I offer something, and this is in the Pickle paper. Now, I don't expect you to read what's on the right-hand side of the screen, unless you've got particularly good eyes. But it's a way of trying to get at the plurality of the metacrisis, because of course, meta is often used as an inclusive term to capture all the different features of the crisis. And that's often how it's used. It's like the metacrisis is the thing that lies behind all of the crises the world faces. But you've got to remember that although it's true that the many are one, the one is also many. And when you're thinking about that, remember that meta means many different things. You know, it doesn't just mean after, it can also mean within, behind, beyond. There's also a metaxy notion, which is like oscillating between. Why does that matter? It matters because the metacrisis here is about linking the COVID reckoning of what was that pandemic all about and how we change the world on the basis of understanding what we've been through. The climate emergency says, do something, act now, a different kind of thing, not a reckoning, but an emergency, time sensitivity writ large. And then the crisis is more about turning point, more about how do we deal with this crisis as a way of asking, now that the world's up for grabs, what do we do with it? That's about people's calling for transformation and regeneration and change the system, change the paradigm. But for all of that, the metacrisis comes in and says, how? Who's going to do it? With what sensibility and imagination? With what spirit? With what values? There was a wonderful moment, I think, in the conversation between Daniel Schmachtenberger and Tristan Harris with Joe Rogan, about halfway through their 3-hour conversation, where Daniel and Tristan are doing a great job, as always, of laying out the conundrums of what's going wrong with the world. And then they begin to speak about what we might do about it in terms of major programs of education, major patterns of cooperation, better technology that's owned maybe publicly. Daniel's line here is that in a world of godlike technology, we all have to become bodhisattvas. So like he's talking about all this kind of thing. And Joe Rogan's line is, because he follows the game theoretic assumptions that Daniel's making, and it's all very coherent, but then he says, I get it, but I don't see it. I get it, but I don't see it. And it was a really powerful moment in the exchange, because this is the problem of the world as we find it. It's not a game theoretical problem. It's a lived experience, life world, spreading butter on toast in a cold room while finding a problem that's going to destroy the world kind of problem. In other words, the movie speaks to that sense of, this is not a puzzle to be deciphered. This is a reality to be lived. And because of that, you need to get the metacrisis in the broader perspective, which means several meanings of meta. And it also means linking it back to the beating heart of the emergency and the toxicity and political nature of the crisis. And unless you do that, it's not clear we're going to ever see it in Rogan's sense. A slightly more elegant, harmonious way of looking at this. Now, you can see the metacrisis procedurally in terms of what is it asking us to do? How do we do it? To respond to the metacrisis, to come back to the question of, I think, Johannes earlier, we can only really deal with the metacrisis if we contend with these questions. Now, this was originally based on an idea of Zach's, which I then tweaked a little bit, and then Mark Vernon added on imagination. So it's a kind of collaborative effort. But we think these 5 questions together get at what might be called the metacrisis when viewed broadly as an educational curriculum. In other words, what do we need to learn today? What kind of capability do we need to move into? How do we need to understand? How do you make decisions? On what basis of legitimacy can we do anything? Like where's the political legitimacy at the moment in dealing with issues like climate change or the pandemic? It's a thoroughly vexed space. And then imagination, can we actually see a better world? Can we actually see where we're trying to get to clearly enough that we can begin to move there in any meaningful sense? So these 5 questions are all very difficult, right? They're really, really conundrums. And someone said to me today that one of the ways of understanding what the metacrisis is it's lots of hyperobjects in collision with each other. And it's a little bit too abstract, but if you think about these questions, they're really, really vexing questions. They're not straightforward, and they co-arise. They're in the same world. And the contention is that to deal with the metacrisis as a kind of here's how you do it, procedural matter, it's one, we take these questions and we live them out. In any given complex scenario, what's going on and how do we know? Do we have what it takes to do what we need to do? Who gets to say what we should be doing and why? What ultimately matters and how do we live accordingly? And what does a viable future look and feel like? These are the living questions that define the procedure of dealing with the metacrisis. So that's one way of thinking about it. And then finally, how can we know it experientially? This is where we come back to the film, because the reason I think the film is a kind of breakthrough and even a new genre, I mean, I didn't dwell on this too much at the beginning, but I think the conventional definition of satire is that it afflicts the comfortable and comforts the afflicted. That was Jonathan Swift's definition. And I don't think either of those things really apply today. I don't think anyone in power is particularly afflicted by this movie, nor do I think people are particularly comforted by it. So I don't really think it's satire. Is it a dark comedy? Well, yes, but what's really going on is it's a kind of documentary into a kind of feeling that we all have that the world is really screwed up, right? This feeling that things are not making sense, they're not intelligible, that legitimacy isn't clear, that we don't have what it takes, or so it would seem, although we can work on that we can't really easily imagine a better world so much. And that we're struggling to make sense of the ultimate meaning and purpose of life, and that these things are part of our lived experience. So what the film does is it helps us to participate in the metacrisis, because it gives us that vicarious feeling, as we always get when we watch a movie, of, oh my God, this is what it's like to live with the metacrisis. And in this context, it's all of the things you saw in the movie. It's the dysfunctional media, it's the distraction of social media, it's the broken families, it's the sense of people drifting and not really knowing what to do with themselves. It's imbalances of power, it's massive inequality. It's all of these things together. And what the film does commendably is it gives you a felt sense for those things together. And that's, for me, the main value of the film. It's that it gives you the experience, a participatory knowing in what the metacrisis is about. And that's why I've watched it more than once. That's why I wanted to talk about it here on behalf of Perspectiva and with the STOA, because I feel like we need more films, more cultural artifacts to help us participate, to sort of know the metacrisis experientially, in my language, to taste the pickle. Because until we can do that, I think we're going to be some way from actually waking up in the way we have to. It's not a simple waking up, right? I mean, people say wake up as if you would therefore know what to do. It's altogether worse than that. It's a first step, right? You've got to become aware that we're in this problem that's much deeper and fuller and wider than we'd care to admit. And then what do we do? Well, the beginnings of the answer are by beginning to answer these kind of questions. But they're also about taking these things really seriously and getting our political leaders to act as if this is what mattered. So when they meet in the Glasgow COP or whatever to discuss climate change, they're not just discussing one issue as if the rest could be held constant and this was the variable. No, these are underlying drivers that have to be attended to. And then, of course, we have to get it all in perspective. We have to sort of teach that this is what the world is today. But we start by millions of people having the experience of it, by participating in it. So that's one way of looking at the metacrisis, through the 4 ways of knowing that John Vervaeke introduced. It's only one, there are many, but that's the one that I felt that the film reminded me of. The value of the film is it helps us participate in the experience of the metacrisis. Thank you very much.
Wow, that's awesome. Really, really love that, Jonathan. So let's pivot to some questions. And just again, raise your hand or put in the chat. Perhaps I'll circle back to Brandon because he had a question related to the metacrisis, and then we'll pick up some new questions.
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and thanks, Jonathan. And I'm reminded of Ariana Grande singing that song, "Just Look Up," you know, like just look up. That's all we need to do, right? And in that case, you know, there was, you know, an obvious comet in the sky, but there's that line in the song, just trust the goddamn qualified scientists, right? Yeah. So who are the qualified scientists? Because in what I'm seeing here, and a lot of people have noticed this in the culture war, we have different sets of scientists or qualified people and different standards for what constitutes, you know, legitimate knowledge or science, and how is it that we just look up?
Right. Well, there's two things there. There's the scientific aspect of that and the looking up aspect. So on the looking up side of things, I find it a very clever kind of trope, heuristic, to make sense of the broader purposes of the film, because when you get to the stage towards the end of the movie where there's kind of the tension's building up and you actually have the Trumpian kind of characters really rallying, saying, don't look up, it's a trick, you know, it's so farcical. And yet this is the power of the film. It's only 1 or 2 degrees removed from reality, right? I mean, Khalil Gibran famously said, a sense of humor is a sense of proportion. And it's often that matter of like, this is just slightly more than that's why it's close to being a documentary, because these things are painfully recognizable. Don't Look Up, of course, could be also the starry heavens above. There's also an issue of, don't dare to ask about the meaning of terrestrial life in a celestial context. In terms of science, it's tricky because I personally don't see this film as primarily a listen to the scientists film. On the contrary, the scientists you see them there somewhat, well, not exactly broken, but certainly, imperfect, regular human beings. And yes, they get backup from the scientific community, and yes, there's a consensus verdict. But then you've also got the scientists working for the tech companies who try and impress you with their somewhat untested, unpeer-reviewed science about using these robots to commandeer the asteroid, break it into small pieces, and then mine the ore for trillions of dollars. That's also science and problematic. So the issue, as has been the case throughout the pandemic, I feel, is that the scientist's job is to advise very clearly and carefully, but it's the political judgment of the leaders that's really what matters. And they need to be scientifically informed and astute, but they also need to have the epistemic agility to move between a scientific verdict and a social and political context where it has to be applied. It's very rare that the science in and of itself will tell you what to do. Usually it tells you the pattern of what has to happen, but not the procedural knowing of how to make it happen. So in this occasion, what I find most interesting about it is that it's a kind of foresight issue. So you see the main character, Kate Dibiasky, seeing on her screen an anomaly. And then she notices, oh my God, the anomaly has a pattern, and that pattern means something. At that point, she doesn't know exactly what she means. She thinks she's found something great. But then they notice, do the math as it were, and the math tells them it's heading directly towards Earth. And then it's no longer good news. But they're the scientists who've seen it. Now, the problem is what they've seen is a computer model based on something that's more than 6 months away. Now, that's not a million miles from the climate models that are often predicting things happening in decades, although increasingly in years, but in decades. People say New York might be underwater by 2100. Now, do people feel that viscerally? Like, does that actually connect emotionally? I'm not sure. For some, it does. But for some, the horizon is just too far away to take seriously. Whereas if you say people in California are going to have more bushfires next year, that focuses the mind. So it's not a simple story of listen to the scientists, although Ariana Grande's line is funny. I mean, it's a really great line in the film, I agree. I saw it more as how do science and political leaders and media combine to allow civil society to find its own agency. Because it's not as one of the best reviews in Current Affairs puts it, this is not a movie that says human beings are the problem. On the contrary, it says human beings are flawed, but basically good and willing, but they're caught up in these systems and structures of corruption and hyper-agency that prevent them from actually living the lives that they'd like to. So yeah, complicated, but it's not just listen to the scientists for me. It's a bit more than that.
Awesome. Would you like to take one more question, Jonathan?
Sure.
Madalena, would you like to ask your question?
Hello, thank you for this and all the work that has gone into creating this unprecedented and improbable space of conversation. I just want to call attention to the fact that this is happening, like the Gutenberg press, it's a new paradigm. So my reaction to the film was seeing it in reverse, starting from the meal, not as the Last Supper or anything in that iconic sort of tradition, but everything that went into it, the laughter, the food preparation, the requisite variety that was sitting around that table of people who would have never met otherwise. And I think if we started to think of that as the way we want to end each day, there would be a ripple effect where relationships are upstream from structures.
Mm.
And so if at the end of the day, that beautiful meal happens for each day, one day at a time, because basically we're caught up in hyper addictions, okay? And as Gabor Mate says, you know, connection, not abstinence. That if we, at the end of each day, work towards having a beautiful meal with the requisite variety, we don't know what the ripple effect might be. Our religion up until, well, for the past, especially exponentially 500 years, is a zit in terms of evolutionary time. I mean, it can be a lethal zit, but in terms of deep time, it's still a very recent thing. And we're acting like we're protagonists in all this when we're really interdependent living systems. Let's start with the beautiful meal, because actually if you solve food, you begin to solve a lot of things, but with the requisite variety, you know, and that's something that's within our daily reach. Thank you.
Thank you, Madalena. Yeah, well, there's a lot to agree with there. And it's certainly true that food is prismatic. There are some who believe that if you look at the world simply through food and all of its aspects, cultural, systemic, nutritional, ecological, you begin to understand a great deal. And if you make food better and plentiful and nutritious and sustainable, then a lot of problems begin to solve itself. And then the cultural aspect of being together at the end, it was touching. What was a little strange about it was that it was a little bit uncanny, because on the one hand, this was a, let's give up, there's nothing we can do, let's enjoy the time we have together. But it did have a little bit of saying, look, it's not clear there's anything better to do. Like, there was a little bit about having that meal together that's saying, us human beings together, breaking the bread, looking at each other in the eye, preparing something, sharing our love for each other, talking about what matters, that may be as good as it gets, right? That was one of the other messages of the ending of the film. Yeah, and I suppose I just want to add that the movie's not really thought to be shocking. You know, you're not really meant to cry about it or anything, but when you begin to see it as a metaphor for climate change, DiCaprio's line, or Professor Mindy's line, you know, we really did have it all, didn't we? It's really worth sitting with, you know, sort of meditatively sitting with, because we do hanker after a great deal more in life, right? We hanker after all sorts of things that may be somewhat beyond what we actually need, both individually and collectively. And so just thinking about that moment of recognition, gosh, this is such a precious existence for in so many ways. And rather than sort of reaching for the stars or reaching for Mars, if you're Elon Musk, grounding yourself in your daily experience as a premise of contending with this collective action problem at scale seems to be a sine qua non, a sort of necessity of how we deal with the climate crisis.
Well, I appreciate your answer, but I think the one day at a timeness of, you know, what it takes for addicts in recovery, and the keep coming part, which is part of what we're doing right here. I mean, to me, this is a beautiful meal, okay? I mean, I don't have to be eating, you know, because there's actual affective engagement in what we're doing here together. And this is new. Yeah. We don't know how an organism learns how to evolve, but we are evolving as we speak right here. and we don't know the repercussions of that. And this fear-based mongering, and the other, a transactional relationship to salvation. If we do this, we will be saved, is what keeps us in that trap of considering that it's about control. And this is why I really appreciate the original comment about death. Death is key in this, absolutely key. Because each one of us can be in touch with the beautiful meal. I mean, I don't know if you saw The Barbarian Invasion, Canadian film, amazing. Dark, but I don't know, Peter, have you seen it? The Barbarian, the Invasion of the Barbarians, it's this professor who knows he's going to die. And so he gathers all his friends to this last meal in a country cottage, but he also gets a dealer to be around to administer what he needs, the cocktail, to be done. I mean, where's the beautiful death here? I mean, let's start with the beautiful death and the beautiful meal. I think if we start addressing both of those systemically, the ripple effect is huge. Because whatever it is that we think is threatened in the West, 3/4 of the world has never had. And they focused as fugitive communities in the beautiful meal, one day at a time. And their resilience, not in this climate change sort of way, but in a way of making meaning out of every day, is built into these practices that we've let go because we're transacting everything. And we think we can postpone death as well.
Yeah.
So I think there are things that are within our reach, including these conversations, because I'm going to leave this conversation with different energy than I came in. And when I was 18 in Portugal in the midst of a revolution, my options were the Maoist Party, the Communist Party, or the Socialist Party, okay? And basically, it was led by crazy leader men who wanted women to be liberated so they could fuck them. That's all, okay? I mean, so, my options then were horrific. And I went into my autistic bubble as an architect or whatever, but I see options right now in this, and the beautiful meal, and the beautiful death. Honestly, I see it.
Thank you.
As an aspiring elder, okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Peter, can I just respond to that quickly?
Yeah.
Just because it's very well taken, especially the beginning where you're reacting against, and rightly so, the idea that we do X in order to save Y, that we recreate the practice of eating together as a family so that we can deal with the climate crisis. I get that that's not the way to think. I understand that we need to rediscover intrinsic value for its own sake. And that's not a minor point. In the same way that Zach's quote that I mentioned earlier about sort of learning to die together is somehow a precondition for having a chance to survive, but not the reason you do it, right? I'm just reminded, I used to play chess professionally, as Peter alluded to earlier, and sports psychology is all about not finding a way to love the process, not the result. But it's also true that people do that partly because they know if they do that, they're more likely to play well and therefore win. So there's something both andish about this conversation, because while it's true that we need to rediscover the things that are of value for their own sake, it's also true that by doing so, they may have broader extrinsic value as long as we don't do it for that reason. So that's why I see it slightly more, fully, I suppose. But thank you, Mel. It was a really lovely sharing. Thanks a lot.
And we passed the top of the hour, and we're only allotted 60 minutes today. So we had a lot of great questions. So Jonathan, if you wanted to save the chat, I can send it to you at the end to check it. But any parting words you have for us about the film, The Metacrisis, or Perspectiva?
Thank you, Peter, for the chance. First of all, someone please save the chat. Evo, I can see you. Somebody just copy and paste it in case we miss it, because it might be useful. Well, I mean, Perspective is we're based in London, and our new sort of way of thinking of our work is we're about overcoming immunity to change in a time between worlds. So we think this is a really critical historical moment. It's not merely a sort of mystical statement to say we're in between worlds. There really is a sense in which a way of living is dying and another is simultaneously being born. And that matters because in that time we're called upon to transform, but transformation is no simple matter. We have to understand it better and orient towards it better individually and collectively. That means certain kind of practices, certain forms of insight, and patterns of emergence and realization. And Perspectiva's work tries to cover all these things in principle. And just one thing to look out for in case I'm not back on the stove for a while, later in 2022, we're creating a course that tries to bring together a lot of the study Perspectiva's done for the last 5 years, the essays, the books, the events, and so forth. And so we're trying to sort of put in process those questions I raised that we're trying to answer, those 5 questions, to begin to build a kind of curriculum around how we might go about doing that. So it has, we begin to feel more energized because it's not about hope, right? It's really not about hope. It's much more about finding discerning action through which the experience of hope may arise or may not. But it's not about sitting there waiting for something to work out well. And I also think the final thought I'd share is, just as Madalena said, this is new, we don't know what this means yet. This is an organismic response using the best technology of the moment, and that could have extraordinarily good emergent properties. Indeed, they could be bad too, I should say, but they may not be. And we have to hope for the best in that sense because we're acting and thereby creating the hope. But the last thing there to add is we actually don't know what we're capable of. Like the climate situation is really, really dire. Like it's worse than I've even said today, I think. If you speak to many scientists, they won't even say it on the record just how bad it is. But there's very much a sense in which we were already too late to prevent significant harm. However, until you act, you don't know what you're capable of, right? Until collectively and individually you make an effort, you really don't know what's possible. I mean that sort of epistemically, philosophically. I don't just mean it as a figure of speech. You literally don't know what you're capable of until you start acting. And therefore, that's the source to find a way of acting with discernment. But what I'd hope is that we actually act on the metacrisis and not just on the climate problem as if it was a distinct issue. We have to find a way of thinking more deeply about how things interconnect, what our collective response is for each of us individually. So a kind of collective individuation in which we all find our own unique contribution to problems writ large. And that's what I want to end with, I think. Beyond that, just, it was fun, thanks for making it possible and thanks for coming.
It was fun. And I really, really love what you're doing, Jonathan, at Perspectiva. And just the approach to the metacrisis, I think it's the right one and it's the needed one. I've been thinking a lot about ontological shock, like how it could be so shocking having this download. And so not only having an embodied approach, but having the models needed to help kind of onboard people to have an embodied approach to the metacrisis is quite beautiful. And I think Perspectiva is at the top of the game there. So if you want to check out more, you can go to the Perspectiva's website and you can give a donation to them here on the chat, which I'll also include on the video description. And I'll just plug a couple of related events coming at the STOA. Benita Roy and John Vervaeke are going to be in conversations for the first time. These are like my 2 philosophical crushes in conversation, so I'm quite excited about this. You can check that on the stoa.ca. And then we have another session related to the metacrisis, the mimetic tribes of the metacrisis. And Brandon, who's here today, created a really good chart, similar to my mimetic tribe spreadsheet, about the different kind of tribes responding consciously and perhaps unconsciously. Brandon, would you like to quickly plug that?
Yeah, it's based on, among other things, Jonathan's article from a few months ago, and also Joe Lightfoot's liminal web. And I'm seeing that a lot of, as you were saying, mimetic tribes seem to agree that there is this metacrisis and have different approaches to dealing with it, in one way or another. And so I was trying to look at how those are related to each other and kind of the teleology. And, so I'm going to be presenting on that in just about a couple of weeks here. Thanks, Peter.
Beautiful. Thanks, Brandon. And you can check all that at the stoa.ca, and then we can continue this conversation at Perspectiva, at the STOA, and elsewhere. So that being said, Jonathan, everyone, thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks a lot.